All right, in this third unit of the course, we're going to be reading some articles in applied ethics. In the second unit of the course, we took a look at two normative theories, two general theories about the nature of right, utilitarianism and Kantian moral theory. And these were attempts to give a general answer to the question, what ought I to do, or how ought one to act, or what is the nature of the right? They are both attempts to identify fundamental moral principles, as we saw. In this third unit of the course, we'll take a look at some specific controversies, some specific debates in ethics, and we'll read articles that present arguments on both sides of the issue. So for this week, we have two articles on abortion. The first one is Thomson's article, Defense of Abortion, and she presents arguments for the position that abortion is morally permissible in some cases. And then later this week we'll be taking a look at an article that presents arguments for the position that abortion is immoral. Next week we'll take a look at the death penalty. We'll take a look at a couple of articles that present arguments on both sides of that issue. And the following week we'll take a look at the issue of the legalization of drugs, and we'll take a look at some articles that present arguments on both sides of that issue. All right, so let's start in on Thomson's article, Defense of Abortion. Thomson argues that abortion is morally permissible in some cases. All right, so she's not arguing that abortion is morally permissible in all cases, but she does believe that it's prima facie, at least at first glance, morally permissible. That is to say, at least in some cases, it is morally permissible. That's the position for which she's arguing here. Obviously, when it comes to the political debate over abortion, there is a range of positions that people hold on that issue. One position, I guess this position would be at one end of the spectrum of the range of positions that one could take. But one position is that abortion is always morally permissible, that there should be no restrictions on access to abortion at all. That is not, I just take time to mention here that that is one position on the spectrum of views in terms of the politics of this issue, as probably everybody knows. But that is not the position for which Thomson is arguing. So I just want to call attention to the fact that she's arguing for the permissibility of abortion in some cases that would put her at odds with some people in terms of the politics of this issue and the range of views that people have on this issue. That would put her at odds with some people that would describe themselves as pro-choice. Some people who would describe themselves as pro-choice defend the position that there should be no restrictions on abortion whatsoever. It's never just of the law to in any way restrict access to that. And as we see here, that is not the position for which Thomson is arguing. So we're taking a look at two articles on this issue this week. There's a range of positions that one finds in terms of the politics of this issue. Just because Thomson is on one side of the issue that might be described as pro-choice, it doesn't necessarily follow that she would agree with every position that falls under that under that heading or within that category. And similarly, when we turn to Marquis's article next time, in which he argues that abortion is immoral, it doesn't necessarily follow that he would agree with every single position that would fall under the heading of pro-life positions. So I'll just start off with that observation. There are a range of positions on this issue in terms of the politics of the issue, but the Thomson article and the Marquis article, which we'll look at next time, are arguing for rather specific claims about the issue. So try to keep in mind the distinction between maybe what you think of as a pro-abortion position or an pro-abortion position in politics. Maybe try to keep clear the distinction between that on the one hand and the positions for which each of the authors is arguing, because they may not be exactly the same, at least as you understand those terms. So keep that in mind. Thomson is arguing that it is morally permissible in some cases. She argues that in many cases, if a woman chooses to carry a pregnancy to term, that's supererogatory. So we've talked about this term before in an earlier context. Here again, there are some actions, some acts that are admirable, praiseworthy, but beyond what morality requires, beyond what moral duty requires, not obligatory, supererogatory. It might be admirable, or it might be highly praiseworthy of a woman to choose to carry a pregnancy to term, but she's not morally required to. She's here again, at least in some cases, Thomson is going to be arguing, she's not morally required to. It's not morally obligatory that she do so. If she wants to do so, that may be admirable, praiseworthy, but it's not obligatory. It's not required. It's beyond what moral duty requires. So that's her position, at least with respect to a significant range of cases. Not in all cases. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So she starts off the article talking about what she calls the traditional anti-abortion argument. And this is the way that she presents it. As she presents it, the argument is that every person has a right to life. Second premise, the fetus is a person, therefore the fetus has a right to life. Obviously, this argument is valid. No question about that. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. And Thomson accepts that this argument is sound as well. Here again, every person has a right to life. She does not deny that. She agrees that this is she agrees that that's a true premise. The fetus is a person. She says that she has doubts about that, but she says that for the purpose of the argument that she's presenting in this article, she's not going to challenge the truth of that premise. She is going to stipulate, she is going to agree to the truth of that premise. So at least for the sake of argument, she agrees that these premises are true. Because as we'll see as we go on to look at her argument in more depth, even if the fetus is a person, that doesn't, although here again she says early on she has doubts about that premise, but even if it's true, it would not in any way undermine her argument. Nothing in her argument hinges on the premise that the fetus is not a person. She does not challenge that premise. So obviously the argument is valid, and she accepts that the argument is sound, at least for the sake of debate. So then she has to acknowledge that the conclusion is true. And she doesn't deny that the conclusion is true. She believes the fetus has a right to life. So that's not what is in dispute in this article. She accepts that this argument is sound. She sees the traditional anti-abortion argument as failing, though, because she does not see that it follows from this conclusion that the fetus has a right to life, which again she agrees with. She does not see, or she argues it does not follow from that statement that therefore abortion is not morally permissible, or that abortion is never morally permissible. That's what she's challenging. She says that in the traditional anti-abortion argument, there's a gap. Traditionally, the anti-abortion argument establishes that the fetus has a right to life. But she goes on to ask, how are we supposed to get from that statement to the statement that therefore abortion is not morally permissible? That's a further conclusion. She agrees the fetus has a right to life, but she does not agree that it follows from that fact, and she does regard that as a fact. But she says it doesn't follow from that fact that therefore abortion is not morally permissible, and she thinks that the traditional anti-abortion argument has failed to explain why it should follow from this statement that the fetus has a right to life, that therefore abortion is not morally permissible. So that's what she regards as the gap in the traditional anti-abortion argument, and she spends much of the article focusing on that gap. So again, every person has a right to life. She doesn't deny that. The fetus is a person. She says early on in the article that she has some skeptical doubt about that. She talks about the analogy of an acorn and an oak tree. An acorn is potentially an oak tree, she says. But from the fact that it's potentially an oak tree, it doesn't follow that an acorn is therefore an oak tree. And similarly, she's inclined to believe that a fetus is potentially a person, but from the fact that it's potentially a person, it doesn't necessarily follow that in the very earliest stages of its development, it's a person. That's what she seems to have doubts about. But here again, nothing in her argument turns on that premise. She doesn't challenge that premise because in no way does her argument depend on the premise that the fetus is not a person. So there's no reason for her to challenge that premise. So she stipulates it, which in any debate is always a good strategy. If there is some premise in your opponent's argument that you don't agree with, but nothing in your argument depends on that premise being false, then just go ahead and stipulate it. Just go ahead and concede that premise to the other side. That is a hallmark of good debating technique, because if you challenge every single premise on the other side, then it looks like here again you're just finding fault, perhaps not always for substantive reasons, maybe just to find fault with everything your opponent says, and that way you come across as less persuasive. She has doubts about this second premise, but she doesn't challenge it. She says, for the sake of the debate over this issue, for the sake of the debate over this issue and ethics, she is willing to concede it. She's willing to stipulate it. She's willing to allow that it is true for the sake of the discussion. All right. She allows the premise that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception. She allows that premise. She stipulates it. She doesn't dispute that, but she asks, how are we supposed to get from there to the conclusion that abortion is morally impermissible? Abortion is not morally permissible. Here again, she thinks that is the gap in which she calls the traditional anti-abortion argument. The traditional anti-abortion argument establishes that the fetus has a right to life, and here again she agrees with that. But it mistakenly just assumes, at least from Thomson's point of view, the traditional anti-abortion argument mistakenly assumes that once it is established that the fetus has a right to life, that therefore it just automatically follows that abortion is not morally permissible. But that's what Thomson is challenging. She says that a premise is missing from that argument. A further premise is needed to establish that abortion is not morally permissible. So the revised version of the traditional anti-abortion argument, as she sees it, would be this. The fetus is a person. Here again, she doesn't deny that. Every person has a right to life. She agrees with that. The conclusion of the first argument was the fetus has a right to life. Of course, that follows necessarily if the first two premises are true. So now in her revised version of the argument, what was the conclusion of the original argument is now introduced as a further premise. But again, as we saw, her view is that this conclusion, abortion is not morally permissible, does not follow from this conclusion of the original argument, the fetus has a right to life. For this conclusion to follow, a further premise would have to be true, and that further premise is this. A person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body. Okay, so this is the revised version of the traditional anti-abortion argument. She supplies the gap, I should say, she supplies the premise that had been missing. As she sees it, there's this gap in the traditional anti-abortion argument. The traditional argument establishes that the fetus has a right to life, and then mistakenly thinks that it automatically follows that abortion is not morally permissible, but that's what she's denying in this paper. For that conclusion to follow from these premises, a further premise would have to be true, and the further premise that would have to be true is, as she puts it here, the premise that a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body. But that premise is false, as Thomson believes that premise is false. So she offers a thought experiment to show why that premise is false. Here again, the premise is a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body. Why, according to Thomson, is that false? Well, just because, as she sees it, just because a person has a right to life, it does not follow that that person has a right to the use of your body. So she offers a thought experiment to bring out this point, that here again, just because a person has a right to life, it doesn't follow that that person has a right to use your body. The first thought experiment that we see in the paper is this violinist thought experiment. She says, I'm paraphrasing here, but the thought experiment goes like this. You were kidnapped and wake up to find yourself attached to a world-famous violinist. A society of music lovers plugged him into you because it was discovered that only the use of your kidneys can keep him alive. If you unplug yourself from him, he will die. You will have to lie in bed for 9 months to save his life. Okay, so she offers this thought experiment as a way of showing that just because a person has a right to life, it doesn't follow that he has a right to the use of your body. So in this scenario, the violinist is a person, and here again, she has already agreed with the premise of the traditional anti-abortion argument that every person has a right to life. So if the violinist is a person, which of course he is, then the violinist has a right to life. But in this scenario, are you morally obligated to lie in bed for 9 months to save his life? Now, it's true, you're in this situation through no fault of your own. You were kidnapped. You're not responsible for the fact that you're in this scenario, of course. But, be that as it may, you now do have a choice to make. Unplug from the violinist and he will die. Or lie in bed for 9 months in order to save his life. Here again, we said earlier that on Thomson's view, if a woman wants to carry a pregnancy to term, that is, in most cases, she believes, that is supererogatory. That might be admirable and praiseworthy, but it's not obligatory. It's not morally required. And so she offers this thought experiment as a way of bringing out that idea, because most people in this situation would say that they are not required to stay in bed for 9 months to save the life of this violinist. But here again, let's agree, violinist has a right to life. But most people do not believe that he has a right to the continued, he would, in this scenario, that he would have the right to the continued use of your body. Most people believe that they would be well within their rights to detach from the violinist, even though the violinist has a right to life. Most people believe that to remain in bed for 9 months would be supererogatory. So some people might well choose to do that, but most people believe that that is not morally required. It's not morally obligatory. It's supererogatory. It's admirable. It's praiseworthy, but it's beyond what morality requires you to do. It's beyond what is required by moral duty. You would be well within. Most people believe you would be well within your rights to detach from violinist, even though violinist has a right to life. So, from Thomson's point of view, that shows that having a right to life does not entail having the right to use someone's body. So here's Thomson's revised version of the anti-abortion argument. So I've just substituted violinist for fetus. The violinist is a person. Here again, that's uncontroversial. That's obviously true. Every person has a right to life. Again, Thomson agrees with that. Third premise, the violinist has a right to life. Well, if the first two premises are true, then this third premise is necessarily true. Fourth premise, his right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. Therefore, conclusion, to unplug yourself from the violinist is not morally permissible. But when presented with this thought experiment, most people believe that to unplug yourself from the violinist would be morally permissible. So most people would not accept the conclusion of this argument. Most people would regard the conclusion of this argument as false. Now, the argument is valid. If these four premises are true, this conclusion is necessarily true, but we've just said that the conclusion is false, so we know that one of the premises has to be false. Again, the violinist is a person, true. Every person has a right to life. Thomson agrees with that, true. Violinist has a right to life, of course, necessarily true if the first two are true. So if this conclusion is false, the only reason can be because this fourth premise is false. And Thomson believes the fourth premise is false. And I think most people would agree with that. His right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. Most people believe that that's not true. Most people presented with that thought experiment, the violinist thought experiment, would say that he has a right to life, but his right to life does not outweigh your right to decide what happens in and to your body. Again, you found yourself in this scenario through no fault of your own, but now you're in it. If you detach, he is going to die. If you remain in bed for 9 months, you can't save his life. Most people think his right to life does not outweigh your right to decide what happens in and to your body. Now, this is a scenario in which you find yourself, again, attached to the violinist through no fault of your own. So, as far as this thought experiment goes, obviously, it would only be analogous to cases of pregnancy where the woman is not responsible for the fact that she's pregnant. And I guess the only kind of case that would fall into that category would be the case of rape. So obviously, this thought experiment is not meant to establish by Thomson that abortion is always permissible. This thought experiment would only cover a case where a woman is pregnant through no fault of her own, is in no way responsible for the fact that she's pregnant, and that's basically only rape. So this thought experiment only goes so far, of course. That's not the great majority of cases of abortion. Thomson does believe that, in general, if a woman wants to carry a pregnancy to term, that's supererogatory. So she believes that not only for cases of rape. So obviously, this thought experiment will only go so far. But it's the first one that she offers to establish the permissibility of abortion in at least that range of cases. The argument is valid, again, and Thomson believes that the conclusion is obviously false. So at least one premise must be false, and again, she finds that the fourth premise is false. From the fact that the violinist has a right to life, it doesn't follow that his right to life outweighs your right to autonomy. We've talked about autonomy a number of times in the class now. Here again, it's just freedom to make your own choices about your own life, to decide for yourself, make for yourself the decisions that affect your own life, that impinge on your own life. Just the freedom to run your own life, to make your own choices about your own life. Thomson believes that the right to autonomy is obviously very important. So she's obviously not coming at this from a utilitarian approach, is she? You'll recall utilitarians don't really talk in terms of rights and don't really talk in terms of a right to autonomy. And nowhere in this argument do you see her appeal to consequences. You'll notice that the article is focused entirely on the issue of rights. She believes every person has a right to life, and she believes that includes the fetus, but she also believes everyone has a right to autonomy. And sometimes rights come into conflict. And when rights come into conflict, one right has to override the other. And sometimes that's not an easy decision to make, which right ought to override the other. But she thinks it obvious in the case of the violinist scenario that most of us believe the violinist's right to life does not override your right to autonomy. You have a right to detach. You would be well within your rights to detach from the violinist. I think that's widely agreed upon. So Thomson spends a good bit of time in the article analyzing the concept of a right to life. And she asks this question: what does it really mean to have a right to life? And she tries out a few possibilities that she ends up knocking down before she finally gives her own assessment of what the concept of a right to life really entails. What does it really mean to have a right to life? She considers a few possibilities. Does the right to life entail a right to be given the resources you need to stay alive? Obviously, many politicians think so. You do hear many politicians say that healthcare is a right. So many people think that there is such a right, obviously. But Thomson does not. Thomson's view is that having a right to life does not entail a right to be given what you need to stay alive. Thomson argues it does not. Does the right to life entail a right to be given the resources you need to stay alive? Thomson argues it doesn't. From the fact that you have a right to life, it doesn't follow that you have a right to be given anything. That's Thomson's view. So she offers a thought experiment that is meant to bring out this point that just because you need something, let me start that again, just because you have a right to life, and just because you need something to stay alive, it doesn't follow that you have a right to whatever it is that you need to stay alive. That's Thomson's view. So she offers a thought experiment. This is on page 339 of our reader, The Ethical Life. And the thought experiment is this: if I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same, I have no right to be given the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow. It would be frightfully nice of him to fly in from the West Coast to provide it. It would be less nice, though no doubt well meant, if my friends flew out to the West Coast and carried Henry Fonda back with them. But I have no right at all against anybody that he should do this for me. So, Henry Fonda was a famous actor back in the day. This article's kind of old now, goes back a ways, so some of you may not be familiar with the actor Henry Fonda, but just substitute any popular actor nowadays, Brad Pitt or somebody like that. And even if that were the only thing that would save your life, as Thomson puts it here, you're sick unto death, that is to say you're going to die from some illness, the only thing that would save your life were the touch of Brad Pitt's cool hand on your fevered brow. It does not follow from the fact that you need that to stay alive that he is obligated to give you that. You have no right to that. He is not obligated to drop everything that he's doing and put his life on hold and fly out from Hollywood and fly out to you wherever you are and provide that for you in order to save your life. Here again, if he wanted to do that, that would be morally admirable, praiseworthy, but I think most of us would agree it would be supererogatory. It would not be, again, it would not be morally obligatory or morally required. It would be above and beyond what moral duty requires. So for him to provide that if he wants to is supererogatory. And again, Thomson's view is that if a woman wants to carry a pregnancy to term, and again, this is in most cases, not all cases. We'll get to this detail of her view a little bit later. She doesn't, here again, she's not saying abortion, just to go back to the point we made at the outset, she's not saying it's morally permissible in all cases. But in many cases, in a significant range of cases, she does believe that for a woman to carry a pregnancy to term is supererogatory. It's beyond what moral duty requires, because as we've seen now, her view is that a pregnant woman has a right to autonomy. She has a right to decide what happens in and to her body, and she agrees the fetus has a right to life, but she does not agree that the fetus's right to life overrides the woman's right to autonomy. Okay, so that's just to recap the argument so far. Again, she's analyzing this concept of a right to life. She takes this concept and subjects it to a kind of logical analysis, and she wants us to try to get a critical understanding of what it really means to have a right to life. So she's tried out one possibility here. It might mean having the right to be given whatever it is you need to stay alive. But Thomson finds that's not true. That's the point of her Henry Fonda thought experiment. She needs the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on her fevered brow to stay alive, but it does not follow from that fact that Henry Fonda has an obligation to give that to her, or that she has a right to Suppose, Thomson writes, that what someone needs to go on living is something he has no right at all to be given. Again, if someone wants to give you what you need to go on living, that's supererogatory. If Henry Fonda, no longer with us, died some years back, so if Brad Pitt, say for example, wants to, here again, drop everything that he's doing, put his life on hold, fly out from Hollywood to put his hand on your brow so that you don't die, that's supererogatory. That's not morally required. He's not morally bound to do that because he has a right to autonomy. He has a right to make the decisions that affect his life. Obviously, to drop everything that he's doing and put his life on hold to do that for you would infringe on his autonomy, or at least it should be up to. That should be decided by appeal to his right to autonomy. If he wants to do that, that's great, but it's not morally required. It's supererogatory. That's the point of Thomson's thought experiment here. Okay, so does having the right to life entail a right to be given what you need to stay alive? No, not according to Thomson. She tries out another possibility. Does the right to life entail a right not to be killed? Again, she finds that it does not. She considers a case in which a woman becomes pregnant and then learns that she has a condition such that she will die if she carries the pregnancy to term. Here again, in this case, she believes that the fetus has a right to life, but the woman also has a right to autonomy. And Thomson believes that in this kind of a case, the woman's right to autonomy has to override the fetus's right to life. She offers a thought experiment to support this point. This is on page 338 in The Ethical Life. She says, suppose you find yourself trapped in a tiny house with a growing child. I mean a very tiny house and a rapidly growing child. You are already up against the wall of the house, and in a few minutes you'll be crushed to death. The child, on the other hand, won't be crushed to death. If nothing is done to stop him from growing, he'll be hurt. But in the end, he'll simply burst open the house and walk out a free man. So Thomson says, in this scenario, you would have the right to kill the child in order to save your life. You would have a right to kill the expanding child in order to save your life. She believes that everyone has a right to life. She agrees with that, but she believes everyone has a right to autonomy as well, including the woman trapped in, I guess in this thought experiment, it could be a man or a woman. I guess it doesn't matter in the thought experiment. Any person trapped in a house with a rapidly growing child that would crush them if they didn't kill it first would have the right to do that. Everyone has a right to autonomy, and everyone has a right to self-defense. So here again, Thomson agrees with the traditional anti-abortion argument that everyone has a right to life. She agrees with that, and she agrees that that includes the fetus. But she also believes everyone has a right to autonomy, and everyone has a right to self-defense. And she believes, in some cases, those rights may override a fetus's right to life. Thomson asserts that if a person has a right to self-defense, then a woman has the right to end a pregnancy that will kill her. She writes, a woman surely can defend her life against the threat to it posed by an unborn child, even if doing so involves its death. This shows, she argues, that, quote, the extreme view of abortion is false, unquote. That is to say, the view that it is not even permissible to save the mother's life. So she thinks that is false if there's a right to self-defense. So she's tried out a couple of ways of understanding the right to life, and again, she agrees that everyone has a right to life, and she agrees that that extends to the fetus. But again, what does it mean to have a right to life? Does it mean you have a right to be given whatever you need to stay alive? Thomson finds no. Does it mean you have a right not to be killed? Again, Thomson finds no. So what does it mean? We must ask then what it comes to have a right to life. On some views, the right to life amounts to the right not to be killed by anybody, but again, this difficulty arises if everyone is to refrain from killing the violinist, then everyone must refrain from unplugging from the violinist. Thomson writes, but does he have a right that they shall refrain from unplugging, unquote, and Thomson's view is that he doesn't. Again, violinist has a right to life, but you have a right to unplug from violinist. Now, unplugging from violinist will kill violinist. as Thomson sees it, that shows that having a right to life does not entail having the right to be given whatever you need to stay alive. And again, as Thomson sees it, this shows that having the right to life does not, let me start that again, a person's right to life does not override another person's right to autonomy. Thomson writes, I am arguing that having a right to life does not guarantee having either a right to be given the use of or a right to be allowed continued use of another person's body, even if one needs it for life itself. So the right to life will not serve the opponents of abortion in the very simple and clear way in which they seem to have thought it would. Thomson notes that, quote, to deprive someone of what he has a right to is to treat him unjustly, unquote. So the anti-abortion argument has to show that abortion is unjust killing. No question but it's killing, but what the anti-abortion argument has to show, according to Thomson, is that it's unjust killing. In the case of unplugging from the violinist, you haven't killed him unjustly because you haven't taken from him something that he has a right to, that is to say, the use of your body. So that is Thomson's analysis of what it amounts to treat someone unjustly. To treat someone unjustly is to deprive him or her of something to which she has a right. So Thomson gives this example on page 341. Again, this is in The Ethical Life. Page 341, she writes, suppose a boy and his small brother are jointly given a box of chocolates for Christmas. If the older boy takes the box and refuses to give his brother any of the chocolates, he is unjust to him, for the brother has been given a right to half of them. Okay, so to treat someone unjustly, on Thomson's analysis of it, is to deprive her of something to which she has a right. So the anti-abortion argument has to show, according to Thomson, that abortion amounts to unjust killing. No question but it's a kind of killing. But the anti-abortion argument has to show that abortion is not morally permissible, the anti-abortion argument has to show that abortion constitutes unjust killing. And that can only be shown if abortion amounts to depriving someone, namely the fetus, of something to which he or she has a right. But as you have some sense now at this point in the article, Thomson's view is that in general there is no right to use someone else's body. In the case of pregnancy due to rape, as we've seen, Thomson argues, the woman has not given the unborn person a right to the use of her body. Okay, so again, violinist thought experiment, that only covers cases in which a woman is not responsible for the fact that there's an unborn person inside her. Here again, in violinist thought experiment, you were kidnapped, so you are in no way responsible for the fact that you're in that situation. So far, so far in the article, all that these thought experiments establish is that a woman has the right to abortion when she is not given the unborn person a right to use her body. But that's not most cases of abortion. So, and Thomson believes that in general, abortion is morally permissible. So there's still more to be established here. And so a relevant question is this: does it make a difference if a woman voluntarily engages in sex, knowing that pregnancy could result, and becomes pregnant? She is partly responsible for the existence of the unborn person inside her. Does that fact confer a right of the fetus to use the woman's body? Thomson believes not necessarily. The fact that a woman had sex and knew that there was a risk of pregnancy and got pregnant, even that, according to Thomson, does not automatically show that abortion would be impermissible. She offers this analogy. If someone leaves his or her windows open and a burglar comes in, then she's partly responsible for the fact that there's a burglar in the house. But the burglar doesn't have a right to be in the house. So even if it's true, even in a case where a woman is partly responsible for the fact that there's an unborn person inside her, it does not follow, according to Thomson, that that person has a right to the continued use of her body. The argument that when a woman is partly responsible for the unborn person being in her, the fetus has a right to the use of her body, Thomson writes, can establish at most that there are some cases in which the unborn person has a right to the use of its mother's body, and therefore some cases in which abortion is unjust killing. So again, she's not arguing that abortion is always morally permissible. She's only arguing that in some cases it is morally permissible. She does acknowledge here the possibility that at some point the fetus does acquire a right to the continued use of a woman's body. She gives an example of a kind of case. This is towards the end of the article, but she does mention a kind of case in which she thinks abortion would be obviously wrong. This is on page 344. She says, in other cases, resort to abortion is positively indecent. It would be indecent in a woman to request an abortion and indecent in a doctor to perform it if she is in her 7th month and wants the abortion just to avoid the nuisance of postponing a trip abroad. Okay, so Thomson does believe that at some point in the pregnancy, a fetus does acquire the right to the continued use of a woman's body. She doesn't draw that line in any very precise way. That's just an example. It's not a precise way of stating where that, at what point the fetus acquires that right. But what she seems to have in mind is any case where it's relatively late in the pregnancy and the woman wants the abortion just for some frivolous reason. In those cases, Thomson thinks it's clear that abortion would be immoral, would be wrong. But she also thinks that that is not most cases. She believes in general abortion is morally permissible. I do not argue, again she writes, I do not argue that it is always permissible. I am arguing for the permissibility of abortion in some cases. And Thomson considers it, as she puts it, a merit of her account, precisely that it does not give a general yes or a general no to the question of whether abortion is permissible. So on her analysis of the issue, when it comes to this question, is abortion permissible, her account doesn't give a general yes or a general no, as she says here. And she thinks that that is a strength of her theory, or her account of the issue. Because obviously she believes that there are a lot of factors that go into it, and there's no simple answer apart from taking into consideration all the many factors that do have moral significance when it comes to this issue. Thomson's position, it should be noted, is at odds with many of the views on the pro-choice side of the political debate. Here again, just because she is arguing that abortion is in some cases permissible, I don't think that you can identify her with any particular position when it comes to the spectrum of views in the political debate over this issue. So many people who call themselves pro-choice, for example, argue that there should be no restrictions at all, no limits on a woman's access to abortion at all. Thomson is not arguing that. She does not argue for an unrestricted right to an abortion, so that's worth noting. To continue the analogy, a woman has only a right to unplug, and she has that only in some cases. If the violinist should somehow survive being detached, one wouldn't, of course, have the right to kill him. So some people, and here again, this is just to bring out the difference between what Thomson is saying and what some people on the pro-choice side in the political debate would say. Some of those people would go so far as to say that if a fetus somehow survives an attempted abortion, and if it is the woman's wish that the fetus be allowed to die, if that's what the woman wants the physician to do, Thomson does not agree with that. Thomson says if a fetus should somehow survive an attempted abortion, at that point, the fetus's right to life has to override the mother's wishes. If a fetus should somehow survive the attempt to abort it, the woman has no right no right such that the fetus must be allowed to die, even if that is her wish. Thomson writes, she may want not merely that the child be detached from her, but more that it die. However, Thomson argues that, quote, the desire for the child's death is not one which anybody may gratify, should it turn out to be possible to detach the child alive. So again, Thomson does believe that everyone has a right to life. So in such a case as this, the right to life would override the woman's wish. So towards the end of the article, she does talk about this. She says in so many words that, well, let's take a look at it here on page 345. Bottom of 344, she discusses this kind of case. She says, a woman may be utterly devastated by the thought of a child, a bit of herself, put out for adoption and never seen or heard of again. She may therefore want not merely that the child be detached from her, but more that it die. But she says down below, a little down from there, she says, the desire for the child's death is not one which anybody may gratify, should it turn out to be possible to detach the child alive. So she says in so many words here that she sympathizes with the woman in that position. She has empathy for the woman in that position, but still the right to life has to override the woman's wish that the fetus be allowed to die.